No one warned him. Accepting the flower of an Apache woman comes with an eternal price. The sun was slowly sinking behind the hills, painting the sky in deep shades of orange and red. The wind carried a dry, dusty scent across the lonely landscape. On this wide, empty frontier, a ranch stood isolated, far from any town. Its wooden fences were weathered, and the land around it seemed endless, stretching out to meet the horizon. The rancher, a man named Thomas, lived alone here. He had been a strong and hardworking man all his life, but loss had made him quiet and reserved. He rarely spoke to anyone beyond polite greetings, and he preferred the company of his cattle and the open land to that of people. That evening, Thomas was walking along the edge of his property, checking the fences for broken boards. He moved with a careful, practiced ease, knowing every corner of the land. The quiet was only broken by the soft lowing of cows and the occasional cry of a distant bird. Life was simple, predictable, and sometimes lonely, but it was the life he had chosen. He had survived hardships before, and he was used to facing challenges alone. Yet there was a strange feeling in the air, something unusual that made him pause and look around. From behind a small rise in the land, he saw a figure moving slowly toward him. At first, he thought it might be someone lost or a traveler passing through. As the figure came closer, he realized it was a woman. Her clothes were torn and dusty, and she seemed tired, almost as if she had been walking for days. Her dark hair was matted, and her feet carried the dust of a long journey. But what struck him most was the quiet strength she carried, a presence that demanded respect even in her weakness. Thomas instinctively moved closer, not wanting to startle her. "Are you hurt?" he asked in his calm, steady voice. The woman looked up, her eyes deep and alert. She nodded slightly, but she did not speak. Thomas noticed a small wound on her arm, a cut that had dried with blood. Carefully, he led her toward his ranch, offering her water and a place to rest. She accepted without a word, moving with a trust he had rarely seen in anyone outside his family. Inside the small ranch house, he helped her sit and offered her some bread and water. She ate slowly, quietly, and with a careful attention to every movement, as if she was unsure what kind of man he was. Thomas watched her closely. He had seen many travelers in his life, but something about this woman was different. There was a calm dignity about her, a quiet resilience that seemed to rise above her present suffering. After a while, the woman reached into her small bundle and pulled out a tiny, delicate flower. She held it out to him with hands that were rough and calloused from the hardships she had endured. Thomas looked at it curiously. It was a small wildflower, simple in appearance, yet it seemed almost sacred in the way she offered it. Without knowing why, he took it from her hands. There was an unspoken meaning in the gesture, something he did not fully understand. She nodded toward him, a faint smile touching her lips, and Thomas felt a strange warmth in his chest. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the hills, leaving only a golden glow over the land. The rancher had accepted many things in his life: hard work, long winters, loneliness. But this small act of trust felt different. It was as if accepting the flower connected him to something greater than the land he tended or the cattle he raised. Over the next few days, the woman stayed at the ranch, slowly recovering from her injuries. Thomas did not ask her many questions, and she did not offer many answers. They communicated through gestures, through shared work, and through quiet observation. She helped him mend fences, gather firewood, and care for the animals. Her presence, gentle but strong, brought a new rhythm to his otherwise solitary life. Thomas noticed how she moved with care and attention, how she seemed to understand the land and the animals in a way he had never seen before. Sometimes she would pause to examine a plant or to watch a bird in flight, and he would see a spark of knowledge in her eyes. It was clear she was not just a wanderer. She had skills, wisdom, and a connection to the world that fascinated him. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Thomas realized that the flower she had given him had not withered. It was pressed between the pages of an old book, and every time he saw it, he felt a strange mixture of curiosity and respect. He did not know the traditions of her people, the Apache, or the meaning behind this simple gesture, but instinctively he understood that it was significant, something beyond ordinary kindness. Life at the ranch slowly adjusted to include her presence. Neighbors who occasionally passed by noticed the woman, and whispers began. Some were curious, some suspicious, and some outright hostile. Thomas, however, did not allow these opinions to affect his actions. He knew she was in need, and he had accepted her trust. He could not turn away no matter the cost. One night, the wind howled outside and the fire flickered in the small cabin. Thomas watched her as she sat quietly, staring into the flames. There was a depth in her eyes, a quiet story that he could not read. He felt a strange connection forming, one that was silent but powerful. It was as if the flower she had given him was not just a gift, but a key, unlocking a bond he did not yet understand. Time passed, and the rancher and the woman settled into a routine. She learned the ways of his land, and he began to understand the depth of her knowledge and resilience. Together, they faced the challenges of frontier life: storms, broken fences, sick animals, and the endless work that defined each day. Yet through all of this, the small flower remained a symbol of something unspoken between them, a promise or a connection that had no need for words. Thomas often wondered what she thought of him. Did she see him as a savior, a helper, or simply as a man willing to lend his land and kindness? He did not know. What he did know was that life at the ranch had changed in a profound way. He felt more alive, more connected to the world around him, and more aware of the responsibilities and choices that now lay before him. And so, as the sun set each evening over the endless plains, the rancher looked out over his land and thought of the small flower, the woman who had given it, and the quiet promise that had begun between them. Little did he know that this simple act of kindness, the acceptance of a flower, would shape the rest of his life in ways he could never imagine. It was the beginning of a story that would challenge him, test him, and ultimately change him forever. Days passed quietly on the ranch, and the rhythm of life began to shift. Thomas, the rancher, found himself noticing details he had long ignored: the way the wind bent the tall grass, the way the cattle responded to gentle words, and even the subtle movements of the sky as the clouds changed color. But what truly changed his days was the presence of the Apache woman. She moved among the animals and the land with a calm authority that fascinated him. Every task she touched seemed lighter, every chore she helped with became easier. Though they spoke little, there was a growing understanding between them. Words were often unnecessary. A glance, a gesture, or even shared silence was enough. She had a way of seeing things Thomas did not. She could spot a weak animal from afar, find water hidden in the dry land, and know which plants were safe to eat or useful for medicine. Thomas watched her work and learned, sometimes quietly following her example, other times assisting when needed. It amazed him how someone so seemingly fragile could carry such strength and knowledge. One morning, while fixing a broken fence near the edge of the property, Thomas noticed her watching him from a distance. She held a small basket filled with wild plants and herbs she had gathered. When he finished, she walked over and offered him a bundle. "For the cattle," she said softly, her words clear and deliberate. Thomas took the bundle, surprised by her thoughtfulness. It was simple, yet meaningful. In her culture, he realized, giving something was never trivial. It carried respect, care, and often a deeper connection than he had ever known. As the days turned into weeks, the woman's presence began to shift the quiet loneliness Thomas had always felt. He found himself looking forward to the moments they shared, sitting together by the fire after a long day, working side by side in the fields, or walking silently along the fence line. The flower she had given him long ago still sat pressed in his old book, a reminder of the trust and bond forming between them. He often stared at it, wondering what it truly meant, and slowly began to understand that it was more than a gesture. It was a symbol of connection, of commitment, and perhaps of a promise that neither of them fully understood yet. But life on the frontier was never simple, and soon the presence of the woman began to draw attention. Neighbors passing by the ranch would glance her way with suspicion. Some whispered rumors, others openly questioned why Thomas allowed her to stay. One afternoon, a man from a nearby settlement stopped by, his face set in a scowl. "I hear you've got an Apache woman living here," he said. "You'd better be careful. People don't take kindly to strangers in these parts." Thomas replied calmly, "She is not a threat. She is hurt and needs help, that is all." The man's eyes narrowed, but he left without another word. Still, Thomas knew the warnings would not end here. Despite the growing tension, life continued at the ranch. The woman proved invaluable, not just in her work, but in her quiet wisdom. She seemed to anticipate problems before they arose. When a storm approached, she warned him to secure the animals and reinforce the fences. When a sick calf fell ill, she mixed herbs and prepared poultices to ease its pain. Thomas, who had relied mostly on brute strength and experience, began to see the value of her knowledge. Her skill was quiet, steady, and deeply rooted in an understanding of the land that Thomas could only admire. One evening, after a long day, Thomas found himself sitting on the porch, watching the sky darken into shades of purple and gold. The woman joined him, carrying a small bundle of dried herbs. She offered him some, not with words but with a gentle smile. He accepted, and for a moment they sat in silence, the only sound being the wind rustling through the grass and the distant lowing of the cattle. In that quiet, Thomas felt a sense of peace he had not known in years. It was as if her presence had brought balance to his world, filling the emptiness he had carried for so long. Yet, Thomas could not ignore the whispers and warnings he had received. He knew that some people in the nearby town viewed the woman with fear or suspicion simply because of her heritage. He also realized that his own choices would come with consequences. Accepting her presence was not just a personal decision. It was a challenge to the prejudices and expectations of the wider community. And though he felt strongly that he had done the right thing, the weight of responsibility began to press on him. One afternoon, while checking the perimeter of the ranch, Thomas overheard voices in the distance. A small group of men from town had gathered near the edge of his property. They spoke harshly about the woman, calling her names and questioning why she was allowed to stay. Thomas's heart sank, but he did not panic. He knew that confrontation was inevitable and he needed to be prepared. Yet he also knew that he could not turn her away. The bond they shared, symbolized by the simple flower she had given him, demanded loyalty and courage. Over the next few days, Thomas and the woman worked in quiet determination. They repaired fences, tended the animals, and prepared for any challenge that might come their way. Every act of labor strengthened their connection. Through shared effort, they learned more about each other's character, values, and resilience. Thomas came to rely on her insights and observations, realizing that her understanding of the land and its creatures went far beyond his own. She, in turn, seemed to trust him implicitly, knowing that he would protect her and the place she had come to consider home. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Thomas finally asked her about the flower. "Why did you give it to me?" he asked, holding the small, pressed bloom in his hand. She looked at him silently for a moment, then spoke softly. "It is a sign of trust and respect. It is more than a gift. It is a promise." Thomas nodded, trying to understand the depth of her words. Slowly, he realized that accepting the flower had bound him in ways he could not yet see. It was not merely an act of kindness. It carried responsibility, loyalty, and perhaps even a lifelong connection. As the weeks turned into months, their days grew more challenging. Weather, illness, and the unpredictability of frontier life tested their endurance. Yet, each challenge only strengthened their bond. Thomas began to see the woman not as a stranger, but as an essential part of his life. She had a quiet way of teaching him patience, respect, and humility. Through her actions, he learned that kindness and loyalty were not weaknesses. They were powerful, enduring qualities that shaped lives more profoundly than brute strength or fear. Despite the growing tension from neighbors and the occasional threats, Thomas remained steadfast. He could see how the woman's presence had changed him. He was more attentive, more thoughtful, and more aware of the connections that truly mattered. The flower she had given him became a symbol of all these lessons, a constant reminder that some choices carried weight far beyond their initial appearance. And though he did not yet know the full consequences of accepting it, he felt a quiet certainty that he had made the right decision. In the evenings, they would sit together and watch the sun sink behind the hills. Sometimes the woman would hum a quiet tune, a melody that seemed to belong to the land itself. Thomas would listen, feeling a sense of calm wash over him. He realized that life on the ranch was no longer about simple survival. It was about connection, trust, and the bonds that formed in moments of shared work and understanding. And all of this had begun with a single, delicate flower. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Thomas felt a quiet sense of gratitude. He did not fully understand the woman, her culture, or the full meaning of the flower, but he knew that their lives were now intertwined. The challenges ahead would not be easy, and he could feel that the choices he had made would carry consequences he could not yet foresee. Yet, in that moment, he was certain of one thing: he would not turn away. He had accepted the flower, and with it, he had accepted a bond, a promise, and a responsibility that would shape the rest of his life. The days that followed were filled with quiet work, small victories, and growing trust. Together, they faced the storms, the labor, and the quiet loneliness of frontier life. And though Thomas had not yet fully realized it, the small, simple gesture, the acceptance of a flower, had already begun to change him in ways that would last a lifetime. It had brought new purpose, new understanding, and a connection that neither distance nor time could break. The weeks that followed brought both calm and tension to the ranch. Thomas had grown accustomed to the quiet companionship of the Apache woman. Her presence had become a part of the rhythm of daily life. Mornings were spent tending to the animals, checking fences, and working the land together. Afternoons often involved tasks that required patience and care, repairing broken tools, mending clothes, or preparing food. Despite the simplicity of these activities, Thomas felt a new sense of purpose. He realized he was no longer living for mere survival but for something more meaningful: connection, trust, and shared life. But the peace was fragile. People from the nearby town had begun to notice the woman living at the ranch. Whispers spread quickly in the small frontier community. Some feared her because she was different, while others misunderstood her intentions. One afternoon, Thomas heard the sound of hooves approaching. A group of 3 men from town rode slowly toward his ranch, their faces set in suspicion. "We've been hearing rumors," one of the men called, his voice sharp. "What's this about an Apache woman staying here?" Thomas stood his ground. "She is injured and needs shelter," he said firmly. "She is no threat to anyone." The men exchanged looks, uneasy at his refusal to explain further. "You should be careful," the leader said. "People don't like strangers living among them. It could bring trouble to you and to her." Thomas nodded silently, understanding the warning, but he also knew he could not send her away. He had accepted the flower she had given him, and with it, a responsibility he could not abandon. As the men left, Thomas turned back toward the ranch house and saw the woman standing by the door, watching silently. He could see the tension in her eyes, the same tension he felt in his own chest. "Do not worry," he told her gently. "I will protect you." No one will take advantage of you here." She nodded, and for a moment their eyes met. There was no need for words. The promise of trust and loyalty was clear between them. Over the following days, the men from town continued to watch the ranch from a distance. Thomas noticed their presence, and he began to prepare quietly for potential confrontation. He reinforced the fences, stored extra supplies, and made sure the animals were safe. The Apache woman helped as much as she could, moving with a quiet strength that impressed him every day. She understood the land in ways he could only admire, noticing signs in the weather, tracks in the dirt, and the subtle sounds of the animals. Together, they became a careful, steady team, ready to face whatever challenges might come. Despite the growing tension outside the ranch, life inside continued to grow in small, meaningful ways. Thomas and the woman developed routines that went beyond work. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sharing stories in silence. Sometimes she would hum softly, a melody that seemed to belong to the land itself. Other times, Thomas would tell tales of his past, of family lost, of struggles survived, of the long, lonely years on the frontier. The woman listened patiently, offering small nods or quiet gestures of understanding. Her presence became a source of comfort and strength, a reminder that even in the harshest of lands, human connection could endure. One afternoon, a storm rolled in, dark clouds covering the sun. Rain began to fall in sheets, and the wind whipped across the ranch. Thomas worked quickly to secure the animals and protect the house. The Apache woman moved with him, her hands steady and sure. She knew exactly what to do, guiding him to reinforce weak fences and calm the frightened animals. As the storm raged, Thomas realized that he had come to rely on her more than he could have imagined. Her knowledge, her instincts, and her quiet courage were invaluable. In the midst of danger, he felt a deep respect and gratitude for her. But the storm also brought visitors, unwelcome ones. That evening, as the rain slowed, Thomas saw figures approaching through the wet haze. A larger group of men from the town had gathered, their faces grim. "We warned you," one of them shouted. "You cannot harbor her here. It is not safe and it is not right." Thomas stepped forward, his voice firm but calm. "She is under my protection. No one will harm her here." The men sneered, some raising their hands as if to threaten, but Thomas did not back down. The bond formed by the flower, by trust and shared understanding, gave him courage he had never known before. Tensions escalated in the days that followed. Thomas knew that defending the woman meant standing against the prejudices and fears of the wider community. He faced the possibility of violence, ostracism, and loss of livelihood. Yet, every time he saw the woman's quiet strength, her calm resolve, and the trust in her eyes, he felt certain he had made the right choice. Accepting her presence and the flower was not a simple act of kindness. It was a commitment, a challenge, and a moral test that he could not ignore. Amid these struggles, small moments of connection kept their spirits alive. One evening, after the confrontations had quieted, they walked together along the edge of the property. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land. The woman pointed to a small patch of wildflowers growing near the stream. "They are strong," she said softly, "because they grow where others cannot." Thomas looked at her, understanding the unspoken lesson. Life, like the flowers, demanded strength, patience, and resilience. It was not always easy, but beauty and survival were possible even in harsh conditions. As time passed, Thomas began to understand more about her culture. He learned that in Apache tradition, giving a flower was more than a gift. It was a sign of respect, loyalty, and connection. Accepting it meant accepting responsibility, a lifelong bond that carried honor and consequences. He realized that he had unknowingly committed himself to a path that would challenge him in ways he had never imagined. Every choice he made from this point forward would matter, not just for him, but for her as well. The community's suspicions never fully disappeared. Travelers and neighbors occasionally whispered or cast disapproving glances. But Thomas remained steadfast, guided by the quiet strength of the woman and the promise represented by the flower. Their bond continued to grow, rooted in shared work, trust, and silent understanding. Through it all, they faced the challenges together: storms, threats, and the ever-present uncertainty of frontier life. One evening, after a particularly long day of repairing fences and tending to the animals, Thomas and the woman sat by the fire. The rain had stopped, leaving the earth wet and fragrant. She handed him a small bundle of herbs, her hands steady despite the long day. He accepted it, feeling the weight of the gesture. Each small act of care reminded him of the growing connection between them. It was no longer simply a bond of necessity. It had become something deeper, a silent promise of loyalty and protection. Yet Thomas could feel the growing tension inside himself. He knew that by protecting her, he was setting himself against the expectations of the wider world. The frontier could be harsh, unforgiving, and judgmental. Neighbors might turn against him, authorities could interfere, and rumors could escalate into danger. And still, he could not turn away. The flower, the trust, and the quiet bond demanded courage, and he found himself willing to face consequences he had never imagined. Days turned into weeks, and Thomas began to notice changes in himself. He was more patient, more thoughtful, and more aware of the responsibilities his choices carried. The woman's presence had opened his eyes to a world beyond mere survival. He saw the value of understanding, trust, and quiet strength. He began to see that the bonds we form, even through small gestures, carry a power that can shape lives and destinies. The flower she had given him was no longer just a token. It had become a symbol of connection, responsibility, and the challenges that true loyalty demands. One afternoon, as they worked together mending a fence near the far edge of the property, Thomas paused to look at her. She moved with purpose, her hands skilled and sure, and he realized how much he relied on her, not just for labor, but for guidance, understanding, and companionship. He felt a quiet gratitude, an understanding that their bond was more than friendship. It was a connection rooted in respect, loyalty, and shared life. The flower, simple yet profound, had brought them together in ways he could not have predicted. Evenings became their time for quiet reflection. They would sit by the fire, watch the stars appear, and feel the comfort of shared presence. Thomas often thought about the future, about the challenges they might face, and about the choices he had made. He understood that the flower had not only bound him to her but had also set a course for the rest of his life, one that required courage, integrity, and steadfast loyalty. Through it all, Thomas remained certain of one thing: he could not and would not abandon her. The bond they shared, symbolized by the small flower, had become a guiding force in his life. Whatever dangers, challenges, or judgments awaited them, he was prepared to face them. Their connection had grown beyond words, beyond simple gestures, and into something enduring, a quiet, powerful promise that would shape both their lives in ways neither could fully imagine. The seasons changed, bringing both beauty and hardship to the ranch. Spring melted into summer, and the land bloomed with wildflowers, tall grasses, and the soft hum of life. Thomas had grown even closer to the Apache woman, whose presence had become a steady part of every day. They worked together, side by side, through the endless chores, storms, and the quiet challenges of frontier life. Yet, even as their connection grew stronger, Thomas could feel the weight of what he had accepted long ago with the small flower she had given him. It was a bond that carried responsibility, and it was becoming clear that life was beginning to demand a price for their trust and loyalty. One morning, Thomas awoke to the lowing of distressed cattle. A sudden illness had struck some of the animals overnight, leaving several weak and trembling. He and the woman immediately went to work, tending to the sick with careful hands and worry etched into their faces. The woman moved quickly, checking the animals for signs of infection and preparing remedies from herbs she had gathered over the years. Thomas followed her instructions, learning as he went. Even though he was strong and experienced, he realized that strength alone could not solve every problem. Wisdom, patience, and care were equally important. As they worked through the morning, Thomas caught sight of the small flower in the woman's hair, tucked behind her ear. It was the same flower she had given him months ago, a symbol of connection and trust. Seeing it now, worn but still bright, he felt the weight of the responsibility they shared. Protecting her, supporting her, and standing by her was no longer optional. It was a commitment that had grown into something much larger than either of them had anticipated. The challenges of life on the frontier were not limited to illness among the animals. One afternoon, a messenger arrived from town, bringing news that a neighboring ranch had been attacked by bandits. The message carried an unspoken warning. Anyone seen helping or sheltering outsiders, especially those considered different, could be in danger. Thomas read the note quietly, feeling a knot tighten in his chest. He looked at the woman, who met his gaze calmly. There was no fear in her eyes, only the quiet acceptance of what they might face. Their bond, symbolized by the flower, gave him courage, but it also reminded him that protection and loyalty came with risk. Days later, the threat became real. A group of men from the town rode toward the ranch, their expressions hard and unwelcoming. They were determined to test Thomas's resolve and intimidate the woman. "You've been warned," one of the men shouted. "She doesn't belong here. Leave her or face the consequences." Thomas stood tall, refusing to back down. "She has a right to stay." "She is under my protection," he said firmly. His voice carried the weight of the bond they had formed, a silent promise that could not be broken. The men sneered, some drawing closer, but Thomas remained steady. The woman stood beside him, calm and composed, showing no fear despite the growing tension. Together, they represented a unity that could not be easily shaken. Yet, Thomas could feel the strain of constant vigilance. Every day required courage, patience, and unwavering dedication. The flower had brought them together, but it had also made them targets, reminding him that loyalty and trust were never without cost. Despite the external threats, moments of quiet connection offered relief and hope. One evening, after a long day of work, Thomas and the woman sat on the porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills. The land glowed in shades of gold and amber, and the soft hum of insects filled the air. They shared no words at first, only the comfort of presence. Then the woman took his hand gently, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. Thomas felt a warmth in his chest, a recognition of the deep bond that had grown between them. The flower she had given him months ago had become more than a symbol. It was a reminder of trust, loyalty, and unspoken love. Life on the ranch was not without sorrow. One morning, Thomas discovered that one of the younger cows had died overnight. The loss was small in the grand scale of life, yet it carried a heavy weight. The woman comforted him with quiet words and gentle gestures. "Life is fragile," she said softly. "But we do what we can, and we keep moving forward." Her calm wisdom grounded him, helping him process the loss and find the strength to continue. He realized that protecting her and the life they shared meant accepting both joy and sorrow, success and failure, happiness and grief. As time passed, Thomas began to understand more about the woman's culture and traditions. He learned that giving a flower was never a casual act. It represented respect, trust, and a lifelong connection. Accepting it was a commitment that demanded courage and integrity. The flower had quietly changed his life, guiding him toward a deeper understanding of responsibility, loyalty, and the true cost of human connection. Every action, every decision, now carried weight, and he could feel the burden of choice settling heavily on his shoulders. The bond between Thomas and the woman deepened through shared hardships. One night, A sudden storm struck the ranch, flooding the pastures and threatening the animals. They worked together tirelessly, moving cattle to higher ground, repairing fences, and ensuring that none of the animals were left behind. Exhausted but determined, they finally rested near the fire, soaking wet and covered in mud. Thomas looked at her and felt a profound respect and gratitude. The flower she had given him had become a symbol of endurance, trust, and shared struggle. Despite the challenges, moments of joy and tenderness found their way into their lives. During a calm summer evening, they walked together along the edge of the property, admiring the wildflowers and listening to the sounds of the land. The woman showed him how to identify certain herbs and plants, explaining their uses for medicine, food, and care for the animals. Thomas listened intently, appreciating not only her knowledge but also the patience and generosity she showed in teaching him. Their relationship, built on trust and mutual respect, grew stronger with every shared experience. But life on the frontier was rarely kind. One afternoon, Thomas received news that a neighboring ranch had suffered a fire, and the rumor spread that those who helped outsiders were being watched closely. The threat weighed heavily on him, reminding him that their choices could carry serious consequences. Yet, even in the face of danger, he could not abandon the woman. The flower, the bond, and the quiet trust they shared demanded courage, and he found himself willing to face challenges he had never imagined before. As the months passed, Thomas began to notice subtle changes in himself. He was more thoughtful, patient, and aware of the consequences of his actions. The woman's presence had taught him that strength was not just measured in physical labor, but in resilience, wisdom, and the courage to stand by one's commitments. He understood that the flower had set a course for his life, guiding him toward loyalty, trust, and a deep sense of responsibility. One quiet evening, as the stars appeared in the night sky, Thomas and the woman sat together by the fire. The gentle glow illuminated their faces, and the air was filled with the soft hum of insects and distant animal sounds. Thomas looked at her, realizing that their bond had grown beyond friendship. The flower, simple yet profound, had brought them together in ways he could not have foreseen. It had taught him about trust, loyalty, and the quiet strength that comes from shared life. Even in the face of loss, danger, and the challenges of frontier life, their connection endured. Thomas understood that the flower was not merely a symbol. It was a reminder of the promises we make, the responsibilities we accept, and the courage required to uphold them. The woman had changed his life, guiding him toward understanding, patience, and a deeper appreciation for human connection. And though the future remained uncertain, he knew one thing with absolute clarity: he would never abandon her. In the days that followed, Thomas and the woman continued their work, their bond strengthened by shared hardship and quiet victories. They faced storms, illness, and the ever-present challenges of frontier life together, relying on each other's strength, knowledge, and courage. The flower remained a constant symbol of their connection, a reminder that trust and loyalty were never without cost, but that they also brought meaning, purpose, and profound human connection. Through it all, Thomas realized that life was not just about survival. It was about the bonds we form, the trust we keep, and the courage to face challenges together. The woman had taught him that loyalty and kindness were more powerful than fear and prejudice, and that true strength came not from isolation, but from connection. The flower, delicate and simple, had opened a path toward understanding, resilience, and shared life, a path he would follow no matter the cost. Time moved slowly on the ranch, and yet it seemed to pass with startling speed. Seasons came and went, painting the land in different colors, bringing both harsh winters and warm summers. Thomas had grown older, his hair touched with gray, his hands worn and strong from years of work. Yet despite the physical toll of life on the frontier, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The bond he shared with the Apache woman had endured, even as the world outside judged, feared, and questioned their connection. The flower she had given him long ago remained carefully pressed in his book, a constant reminder of the promise and responsibility he had accepted. The Apache woman had become an inseparable part of his life. Together, they had faced storms, illness, and human prejudice, but they had also shared laughter, quiet victories, and moments of deep understanding. Her knowledge of the land, her patience, and her quiet wisdom had transformed the way Thomas saw the world. He had come to realize that the bond created by accepting the flower was more than loyalty. It was a union of souls, a connection that transcended words. Yet, as time passed, he also came to understand that such connections carried eternal consequences, a truth he could not ignore. One spring morning, Thomas noticed that the woman seemed quieter than usual. She moved among the animals and the land with her usual grace and efficiency, yet there was a subtle sadness in her eyes, a depth of thought that Thomas could not immediately understand. He approached her as she gathered herbs near the stream. "Is something wrong?" he asked gently. She looked at him with a calm expression, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and determination. "I have matters to attend to," she said softly. "There are obligations I must fulfill with my people. Soon I must leave." The words struck Thomas like a sudden wind across the plains. He felt a pang of fear and sorrow. The bond they shared was unbreakable, he knew, yet the thought of her leaving brought a heaviness to his chest. "Will you come back?" he asked quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. She shook her head gently. "I do not know. My path may not return here, but the bond between us cannot be undone. You accepted the flower, and with it our lives became connected. That connection is eternal, no matter where I go." Days passed slowly as they prepared for her departure. Together, they worked in silence, tending to the animals, securing the fences, and performing the countless small tasks of ranch life. Each moment felt heavier than usual, filled with unspoken emotion. Thomas noticed how every gesture, every glance, seemed to carry a weight of meaning. He realized that the simple flower, once a small token of gratitude, had grown into a symbol of a lifelong connection, one that could not be erased, no matter the miles or years that might separate them. On the final morning, the sun rose over the horizon, casting a golden glow across the land. The Apache woman gathered her belongings, small and simple as they were. Thomas stood beside her, holding the flower that had started it all. They said no words at first, only shared a look filled with understanding, love, and respect. He felt a mixture of gratitude, sorrow, and awe. The woman's presence had changed him in ways he could never have imagined. She had taught him patience, courage, loyalty, and the true meaning of human connection. As she prepared to leave, she touched his arm gently. "Remember," she said softly, "our bond is stronger than time or distance. You carry it now as I do." Accepting the flower was more than an act of kindness. It was a promise, one that lasts beyond life itself. Thomas nodded, feeling tears welling in his eyes. He pressed the small flower into his hand, knowing that it would remain with him always, a reminder of the bond, trust, and love they had shared. The days following her departure were quiet. Thomas continued his work on the ranch, tending to the land and animals as he always had. Yet the absence of her presence left a deep, unspoken ache. He often found himself staring at the flower in his hand, remembering her quiet wisdom, her gentle guidance, and the countless ways she had touched his life. Though she was gone, the lessons she had imparted and the bond they shared remained alive within him. He realized that life's meaning was often measured not by what we possess but by the connections we nurture, the promises we honor, and the love we carry in our hearts. As months turned into years, Thomas continued to live a life shaped by the choices he had made. The ranch remained his home, the animals his companions, but his heart held the memory of the woman and the bond symbolized by the flower. Travelers passing through would occasionally ask about the Apache woman, and Thomas would simply smile, knowing that her story was not one easily told. The bond they shared was sacred, private, and eternal. It was a connection beyond words, beyond explanation, and beyond the understanding of those who had never walked in their shoes. One evening, as Thomas sat by the fire, he reflected on the lessons he had learned. Accepting the flower had been a simple act, yet it had changed the course of his life forever. He had faced prejudice, threats, and challenges, but he had also experienced loyalty, trust, and the deep, quiet beauty of human connection. The flower had been a key, unlocking a path that demanded courage, patience, and integrity. It had shown him that every choice carries consequences, but also that love and trust are worth the risk. As he looked out over the land at sunset, Thomas realized that the flower had become a part of him, a symbol of all he had endured and all he had learned. He felt gratitude for the woman, for her wisdom, her guidance, and the bond they had shared. Though she had returned to her people, he knew that their lives were forever intertwined. The promise carried by the flower was eternal, a quiet, unbreakable link that would endure beyond time, distance, and even death. Years later, when Thomas grew old and his hands were too worn to tend the land as he once had, he still kept the flower pressed carefully in his book. Its colors had faded, but its significance had only grown. He would often sit by the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon and feel her presence in the wind, in the rustling of the grass, and in the quiet rhythm of life around him. The bond they shared, born of a simple act of trust, had shaped his entire life. It had taught him about loyalty, responsibility, courage, and the eternal power of human connection. Even as time moved forward, the memory of the Apache woman remained vivid. Travelers and neighbors noticed that Thomas carried himself with a quiet dignity, a calm strength that came not from fear or power, but from experience, understanding, and the knowledge of a bond that could not be broken. The flower was a reminder that some choices made in kindness and trust carry lifelong consequences, but that these consequences are not burdens, they are gifts, shaping who we are and the lives we touch. And so, Thomas lived out his days with a quiet peace. He worked the land, cared for the animals, and carried the memory of the woman with him. The flower remained a sacred symbol, a reminder that accepting kindness, trust, and love sometimes comes with a price, but also with a profound reward. The bond they shared had taught him that human connection is eternal, transcending distance, time, and even absence. When his time eventually came, Thomas passed quietly, holding the small flower in his hand. It had been his companion, his guide, and the symbol of a bond that had shaped his entire life. Those who found him later would marvel at the calmness in his expression, the quiet strength that remained even in death. They would not understand the full story, the deep connection, or the promise carried by the tiny, pressed flower, but Thomas had understood. It was a connection that could not be broken, a bond that endured beyond life itself, and a testament to the power of trust, loyalty, and love. In the end, the flower had been more than a gift. It had been a key, opening a path of courage, endurance, and human connection that changed a man's life forever. Accepting it had been the beginning of a journey that required strength, patience, and unwavering loyalty. And though the Apache woman had gone, her presence, her wisdom, and the bond they shared lived on eternally, carried in the heart of the rancher who had learned that some choices, no matter how small, have a price and a power that lasts forever.